Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the educational philosophy over at Sense of Study, and we're going to explore how a recognition-first approach is trying to fundamentally change K-12 STEM education. We're going to look at exactly how this platform takes standard North American math and science curriculums and completely restructures them so that students can finally grasp what they are actually looking at.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the recognition problem, then move on to designing a better lesson, check out the science of learning, compare this to the tutor alternative, and wrap up with the parent contract. Let's get right into it.
All right, part one, the recognition problem.
To really understand why traditional education methods can leave students so stuck and frustrated, we have to look at how they test. Have you ever wondered why a student can completely memorize an entire textbook chapter, absolutely ace their flashcards at the kitchen table, but then just completely freeze when faced with a blank test paper? It's an incredibly common phenomenon. They have all the definitions locked in their brain for sure, but when they look at a word problem, they have absolutely no idea which formula to actually pull out of their mental toolbox.
To illustrate this, let's use a quick micro-case study from statistics, independent events. The definition is pretty straightforward, right? Two events are independent if the outcome of one doesn't change the probability of the other. So if you flip a fair coin twice, that second flip literally doesn't care about the first one. So if you want the probability of getting two heads, you just multiply 1/2 by 1/2 to get 1/4. Easy enough.
But here's the crucial point. Just knowing that definition is simply not enough. Students absolutely must be taught the clues that tell them when to actually use it. Sense of Study builds every single lesson around one defining rule. You must teach the recognition problem, not just the definition. Knowing how to multiply probabilities is entirely useless if the student doesn't recognize that the problem sitting right in front of them is asking for independent probability in the first place.
Moving on to part two, designing a better lesson.
Sense of Study essentially redesigns the entire architecture of a standard lesson to fix this exact issue. On every single lesson page, they add three very specific sections that most traditional textbooks just completely skip. First, a mental model. This is a short, sticky phrase to capture the concept, which is way easier to recall than a rigid academic definition. Second, a recognition checklist. This gives students the exact clues in a problem that signal when the concept applies. Actually, fun fact, this is the single most asked for thing students miss in textbooks. And finally, a comparison table, offering a side-by-side contrast to help tell apart lookalikes, like disambiguating independent versus dependent versus mutually exclusive events.
And get this, they have rigorously scaled this exact 13-section lesson structure across a staggering 998 lessons. We are talking about comprehensive coverage across 5 subjects: math, physics, chemistry, computer science thinking, and statistics. Every single concept gets this specialized treatment, backed up by over 51,000 practice questions, where every single worked solution is human-reviewed. That's a massive undertaking.
Which brings us to part three, the science of learning.
Now, you might be asking yourself if this actually works in practice. So let's look at the decades of learning science research backing this up, because an elegant structure is really only as good as the cognitive science supporting it. First up, broad concept mastery research across STEM education proves that recognition trumps rote recall every single time. It is a proven fact that students who can recognize when a concept applies will consistently outperform those who can only recite the definition from memory. Recognition is basically the bridge between abstract theory and real-world problem solving.
Second, they build in retrieval practice based on Roediger and Karpik's famous 2006 work on the testing effect. This research clearly shows why spaced retrieval beats mass practice, which is just a fancy term for cramming, when it comes to long-term memory retention. By forcing students to repeatedly recognize and apply concepts over time, the knowledge actually sticks. It doesn't just vanish the day after the test.
And third, we have to look at cognitive load theory, specifically John Sweller's research from 2010. This entirely validates why Sense of Study uses worked examples that actually teach the why behind the math. Sweller found that worked examples paired directly with explanations produce vastly better knowledge transfer than just tossing examples at a student alone. It reduces mental strain and actually allows the student to internalize the logic.
All right, part 4, the tutor alternative.
So, how does this highly structured, software-driven approach compare to the traditional route of just hiring a human tutor for your kid? Well, what's really interesting here is the financial contrast. If you hire a traditional tutor for $40 a session, just once a week, you're looking at spending around $1,600 a year. In stark contrast, Sense of Study's family plan covers up to 5 children for just $99 a year. Let that sink in. That means the software is 16 times cheaper, basically acting as a tutor on call for less than the price of a couple of coffees a month.
But hey, let's be completely fair to human educators here. Software cannot do everything. Human tutors do incredibly important things that software simply can't do, like diagnosing specific learning disabilities, building personal human rapport, and reading a student's body language to see if they're getting frustrated. However, for the core mechanical tasks, the explanation of concepts, pacing the curriculum, and tracking progress, this software replaces roughly 90% of what an off-campus tutor does at less than 5% of the price. That is a game changer.
And that leads us to our final section, the parent contract. This brings us to the operational core for parents. How do you actually know your child is progressing and mastering the material if a human tutor isn't sitting right there at the kitchen table with them? Well, Sense of Study replaces the traditional tutor's verbal feedback loop with what they call a 3-pillar contract. First, mastery. This is strictly enforced. A student must score at least an 18 out of 20 on a concepts practice pack to prove they actually get it. Second, cadence. Parents pick 2 standing time slots a week, and the software actively scores whether those study sessions actually happen. And third, visibility. Parents get a one-glance dashboard report that tells them in 5 seconds exactly how their kid is doing. The promise here is that if a student is falling behind, the parent is going to see it on this family dashboard long before they ever see it on a bad report card. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the big picture and ask a rather pointed question. If this recognition-first approach is so structurally effective, backed by cognitive science, and can replace the vast majority of what a tutor does for a fraction of the cost, are we looking at the end of the traditional STEM textbook? When students can finally learn to recognize a problem rather than just blindly memorizing its definition, the whole game changes. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to think about how you, or the students in your life, are currently tackling the recognition problem.